Sometimes you meet somebody and you think immediately, I need to work with you. And Lucinda Soon is one of those people. She's a former lawyer. She's now an academic and a consultant around workplace wellbeing with a particular focus on the legal profession. And Lucinda's going to share some research, some of her own and some from others around the state of mental health in the legal profession, why we're doing this, as well as around measures that actually work to make things better. Does that sound what you're going to do? Brilliant. Over to Lucinda.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to Mindful Business Charter and for the sponsors for making this event happen. I'm so thrilled to be speaking in New York City. You know, I kind of arrived on Tuesday and have been in awe ever since. So lovely to be here. Right, I'm just going to try and, yes, technology works, great. So I'm Lucinda Soon, and I'm going to be talking to you today from a research perspective, talking about insights from the past 50 years in respect of lawyers' wellbeing. So I'm not going to spend too much time on me. I do have a website where you can learn more about me. I am a former legal ethics and regulatory lawyer. So I just wanted to start actually. I mean, when a lot of people I speak to and a lot of people who speak to me, we talk about productivity, we talk about high performance as an industry of legal services, and that's where we should be aiming for, and that's absolutely right. When we talk about well-being, we are really talking about how we can be well from a productivity, from a profitability perspective. But coming from a legal ethics, my background, I think it's really important also, and also being in this room, which I've spoken to a number of people today and said, this is an amazing room. We're surrounded by, many of the former greats of our profession. And to remember that actually when we talk about well-being, we are also talking about us as a profession being who we are in terms of serving law, in terms of serving society. And to have that in mind, that when we talk about well-being, we are also talking about enabling us to function well as lawyers, but we're also enabling society to function well. But yes, so that I'm a former lawyer. I'm also an organisational psychologist, a doctoral researcher at Birkbeck University of London. I also teach psychology to law students at King's College London. And I also work with firms in terms of helping them from a research and evaluation perspective, using data and evidence to drive better well-being within their organizations. So today I will be starting with theory. Please do not glaze over. Theory is very important to help us to structure our understanding of well-being. I'll then go on to talk about what do we know about lawyers' well-being, drawing on my research and that of many others over the past 50 years, mapping what we currently know. What do we do, how do we talk about well-being when it comes to lawyers, and how can we frame that in the work environments that we work in? Then I'll be moving on to talk about, could job resources hold the key? So my research is very much oriented towards resources, and I'll be talking a bit more about what that means and how we can put that into practice. And then finally, well, the billion-dollar question: how can legal organizations build healthier workplaces? And then hopefully there'll be time for some questions. So talking first about theory, well-being, ill-being. I'll be running through three key models, which are quite dominant in the field of organizational psychology. And the first is the job demands resources model. And I'm sure some of you in the audience here will recognize this model. It's been pretty much the dominant model over the past 30 years. And it really introduces the idea of job demands and job resources. And I'll be talking about, these two key actors when we think about well-being. And really it showed different pathways. So when you are in an environment where you have lots of job demands, law is a challenging profession. It is quite demanding, but when those demands get too much, that leads to strain. That leads to the kind of negative well-being, or ill-being really, that we talked about. So that mental ill-being, stress, anxiety, depression. But there is another pathway, and that is led by job resources. And that leads to what we were talking about earlier, was the kind of well-being, the where we want to be, the work engagement, the kind of productivity, the motivation. And that is really down to the resources such as support, autonomy, kind of the constructive feedback, development, all of those positive things is really where we want to be. But those two pathways don't just exist separately. They interact with each other. And again, this is theory, but this is backed up with 30 years of good evidence to suggest that this is actually what's happening. And so when we are in an environment where the demands are actually outweighed by the number of resources that lawyers have, this is protective. These are protective factors. These buffer the demands in our environment, and that can override and lead us to a state of positive well-being. But equally, job demands can actually have that negative interaction. Again, if we imagine scales, if we talk about job demands being excessive, even though you have job resources in your work environment, that can lead to a state where we don't want to be, where we're experiencing stress, anxiety, depression, burnout. The next theory is conservation of resources theory, and this is a theory which my research lends heavily towards, still talking about demands and resources. And a lot of researchers have actually combined job demands resources model with conservation of resources theory. And this is, if you imagine previously we talked about these two pathways, conservation of resources theory really explains what is happening on those two pathways. And it talks about loss spirals and gain spirals. Loss spirals happen really easily, just by their nature. When we experience demand, we enter a cycle of loss where it leads to ill-being, but the more demands, we don't have those coping mechanisms, that kind of, if you like, resilience to cope with the demands that we might meet. And so that cycles down into a loss. The other one is the gain cycle. Again, this is where we want to be to reach that state of well-being. And we are there talking about resources. We're almost flooding the environment with resources. We are entering into that gain cycle. Gain cycles are unfortunately harder to kind of instigate, but once you do that right, they rapidly go upwards, and that's where we want to be. And the third model is the igloo model. This was developed by a number of academics from various institutions, mainly in the UK, but two from my institution at Birkbeck University of London. And why I introduced this is because it's really, I think it's important to recognize that job demands and job resources can appear at several layers of the igloo, at the individual, the group, the leader, organization, and the overarching context. And I've put this in there because as I'll come on to talk about, when we think about solutions, it's equally important that we think about solutions at each level and what has historically happened. And this is not unique to the legal profession when we talk about well-being, it's other occupations, professions. We tend to focus on the individual. We tend to focus on, giving people the skills to navigate the demands within their environment. And that's that's the base of the igloo. That's important, but there are many other ways that we need to bolster that, and it takes all of those levels. All of those levels are important. Okay, so what do we know then about lawyers' well-being at work? And this was a paper that myself and colleagues published last year, where we realized that a lot of good work has been done in terms of studying lawyers' well-being, but it was a bit all over the place. There was, it was very fragmented. You had bits and pieces, and what we wanted to do is systematically synthesize what there is by by that, so it is a systematic review, and essentially that means we're not cherry picking studies. We are systematically going through the databases to find out what do we know. So we looked at the global literature. So not just, I mean, myself and colleagues were based in the UK, but we wanted to look at what the global position is. We wanted to look at empirical studies. So those are studies which have been done using, experiments, for example, or correlations. So look at data that associate, between different factors and outcomes. But we also want to look at those surveys that have been done by many countries, by professional bodies, and also academic writings. And by that, I mean, they may not be based on primary data collection, but they are based on theory, academic conceptualization of, what might be what might be the issues. So we had a number of questions, such as, what is the breadth and nature of the literature? What do we know? What do we talk, what do we mean when we talk about lawyers' wellbeing? How is it conceptualized? And again, how does work context influence wellbeing in the legal profession? So just a bit of the mapping. So just to explain this graph, it is as of the date that we published our review, which is 2023. And so it may look like it's tailing off, like interest is being lost. That is not the case, because the kind of the last section is from 2020 to the present day. And we are only in the last, the first few years of this decade. But what we can see generally is a quite exponential rise in studies. The darker line is the empirical studies. The kind of lighter as we go down is the kind of the academic writings, and then industry reports have also kind of followed that same trend. So what we are seeing is interest is growing in response to the issues becoming more prominent as we're going through the years. And even though we talk about lawyers' wellbeing as, we may think it's relatively new, that we are seeing this as a recent phenomena, it's actually, that's not the case. The earliest study on burnout in lawyers was 1986. That was an American study. And they were raising issues then, the academics then, saying that burnout is through the roof in the legal profession. That was in the 1980s, 30 odd years ago, nearly 40 years ago. And we are pretty much in the same position now, or if not worse. So this is not new, what we're talking about. The number of empirical studies. So for academics, empirical studies are like, they are where, academics are collecting data and analyzing that data. So these are really where we are wanting to look at, the empirical studies. And it's, you can see there that the US is leading the way in terms of the number of studies that have been done in this space. Australia is next in terms of, the attention it's getting. Australia is actually moving further ahead at quite some speed in the last few years. And that has been driven in large part by primary legislation, which has just come in Australia, which has made it mandatory for all employers, not just law firms, all employers, to measure and risk assess hazards in the workplace that can lead to poor mental health. United Kingdom, shamefully for me, is although third's not bad, is kind of, we need to do more in the UK. But you guys in the US, you really doing some great work in this space. But it's not, what our review showed is that this is a global situation. We have studies that have been done, which don't often get talked about, but those in other countries around the globe, and they are reporting the same thing. So yes, there will be cultural differences, but the profession has always been a global profession. We are, I look to lawyers in the US, and I'm a UK lawyer, but you are part of my community. So we have always been, as a profession, a global profession, and we need to work together across the world on this. This has been touched on before. There has been a predominant focus on ill-being. I think it was George who mentioned about, the difference when we talk about well-being, ill-being, really a lot of times we're talking about ill-being. And that has come through in the studies as well, is that it's primarily conceptualized as ill-being. We're talking about stress, anxiety, depression, burnout. Alcohol and substance use is an issue, which particularly studies in the US have highlighted. Trauma symptoms, particularly in subpopulations of lawyers. So I'm talking about in certain fields of law, such as criminal law, family law. There have been cases where, post-traumatic stress disorder, vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, and that comes from the nature of the work in almost working with vulnerable clients, hearing them recount their traumatic experiences can have that impact on lawyers who then experience that and take it on themselves. So that's come through in the research. This also was mentioned before, suicidal ideation has been reported at rates higher than other professionals and the general population. So we know, I don't have to tell you all again, there are problems, but the positive features of well-being have received very little attention. And this is an issue in my eyes, because when we come to think about how can we make things better, where should we be aiming for? We need to be looking at beyond the baseline. The World Health Organization talks about well-being as more than the absence of ill-being. We need to be thinking about, we want to reach that state of work engagement, work commitment, job satisfaction, ethical, maximizing our ethical behaviors, productivity, profitability. These are the things where we need to be going through. So actually to get there, we need to be thinking about, okay, so how do we make people well, not just unwell? So again, this has come out from my review of over the past 50 years, and what we can see is there's lots of pressures. So I don't think this slide is going to surprise anyone. A lot of this has been mentioned already. But this just kind of goes to show that, often when we think about it's, the workload, for example, time billing targets, yes, they are one part of the bigger picture, but there are many other factors that are involved, and they all connect with each other. So, high competition, time pressure, accelerated pace of work, that kind of lack of control, autonomy, lack of manager training is something which I'll go on to talk about a bit more, because this is an area which I find incredibly interesting. And I think it's an area which it's something which can have a huge difference, because, line managers are like first responders. They are the closest to the daily pressures of the people they manage, and they have the power to create change. So, having the training is really important. But this just goes to show that there is so much there in terms of pressures. So moving on to job resources then, how can we improve lawyers' well-being? This hasn't been published. This is the second study that I've done, and it's going to be, we're writing up at the moment. And really it's talking about taking a resource-oriented perspective. I wanted to kind of put this back in, so talk about, back to the theory, how job resources are the protective pathway. They can buffer the demands, how we need to get into that gain spiral. What can we do? So let's look at, could resources actually hold the key? And if we think about scales, where we want at the very least, at the very minimum, is for those scales to be balanced. So you have enough resources to outweigh the demands that people are facing. But really where we want to be is for that to be tipped in favor of resources. So we want to, reduce demands, but increase resources at the same time. But, reducing demands can be something which over the long term we should be aiming to achieve. It can be difficult. I'm sure some of the questions will come through that saying, about how do we actually reduce demands? Like, does that mean like cutting billable hours? Does that mean cutting workloads? I mean, ideally, yes. Those are the hard questions which are ultimately, we can't skirt around them anymore. We do have to reduce the workload. But in the interim, we can do more to boost resources, which at least will buffer the perceived demands that we are putting people under. So what I did was I wanted to talk to lawyers and find out what's important to them. So resources are really those things which lawyers value. Those are the things which they strive to achieve. That's where we want to give lawyers those resources. So what resources are we talking about here? So I spoke to lawyers in two distinct contexts because, we know that the legal profession is not just one group of lawyers all doing the same thing. We all work in different contexts. The big city firms doing corporate mergers and acquisition transactions. But then there are kind of, what we call in the UK, legal aid lawyers or the public service lawyers who then their work environment and the nature of their work is very different. So I kind of wanted to look at these two contexts, which very much, they are pretty much at the opposing ends of the continuum. And along that continuum, you also have in-house lawyers, many different other contexts. But to find out, what kind of things do they value? What resources should firms be giving them? And this is some of the resources that have come out of my research. So this hasn't been published yet, but this is what lawyers were talking about. And it's not just, lawyers just, when I spoke to them, it wasn't, oh, just reduce the workload, just reduce the workload. It wasn't that at all. It was lots of other things, which they said, you know what, if you kept the workload and gave me all this other stuff, this would make my life easier and this would make me well. So we're talking about intellectual stimulation, which came up quite high. And as lawyers, I don't think that surprises. We are very intellectually oriented. We like to be challenged. It's not like we're fearful of challenge. We want to be challenged within the right context. Purpose and meaningfulness, and I have to go back to standing in this room with Ruth Ginsburg staring at me, we cannot forget that the purpose, why we are here as a profession, the meaningfulness that we get from the work that we do. Work-life integration has been spoken about previously. For me as an ethics lawyer, professional ethics and standards was when a few people talked about that, I thought, yes, that's great. Being around those who uphold professional standards and ethics is important. Autonomy and control, psychological safety. Again, none of this is really that, as someone said earlier, it's not rocket science. These are kind of basic human needs, if I can go that far and say. Role, task, and clarity. I'm not going to go through all of them. But what came out as the top one thing, which all lawyers talked about at in great detail, and which actually has informed my next study, where I'm going to go into deeper as to this particular resource, is supportive supervision. So I talked about earlier about supervision and manager training being really important. Well, actually, lawyers think so too. They talked about, if I had a supervisor or a manager who really took the time to listen to me, who supported me, who when things went wrong, didn't suddenly take someone else's side, but actually had my back, who trusted me, those things really are important. So it's a supportive supervision, it's actually, that's what I'm studying, going on to study next. So building healthier workplaces, what do we need to do then? Taking all of that into consideration and taking a holistic approach to interventions. I don't know whether some of you have seen this previously, but this, so the World Health Organization and the International Labour Organization got together back in 2021, and they published this in 2022. They published a mental health at work policy brief, not specific to the legal profession, but to all occupations and professions. And they pretty much put this diagram together, and I thought it was brilliant because for many years I talk about the 3 levels, and in academia we talk about the primary, secondary, and tertiary level, and that's really quite, when I've said that before, I do get a kind of a glazed over look. Primary, secondary, tertiary, yeah, what do you mean? But actually, this language speaks to people. What the primary is the prevent level. It's not waiting for something bad to happen. It's actually preventing ill-being from happening in the first place. And to do that, again, we need to address the hard questions. We need to change the work environment. When you have a plant and it's dying, what we don't do is tell the plant to do better. We don't, actually, we may actually pour some stuff in it to help it to grow better. But if it's in a shaded, cold area, we don't say, why are you not growing? Why are you not flourishing? We move the plant. I mean, I love plants, that's why but if I saw my plant almost wilting, I would move it to a sunnier place. I will make sure the conditions or the work environment are there to support it. I wouldn't just tell it to do better or try to, pump in loads of minerals, which would help also. But we are talking about shaping and reshaping the work environment. And it talks about psychosocial risk management, which is identifying, measuring those hazards in the work environment, and then actually taking action to change that. The secondary level is the protect and promote. So this is when issues are already there, but we do need to, I'm not saying that we don't need to focus on the individual and give them the skills and education and awareness to protect and promote their well-being. And this is really helping them, this is where manager training comes in. This is where giving individuals the skills to support their well-being. And then the tertiary is the support level. And this is when things have already gone wrong. This is where people are already taken ill, and we have to help them to, it's almost like a rehabilitation back into the workplace. So the secondary and tertiary levels, protect and promote and support, a lot of work has been done there. I think firms do a lot in terms of, employee assistance programs is one of those things. Firms do that. But what we are lacking is a focus on the prevent level. And evidence suggests, not just in the legal profession, again, in organizational psychology more generally, that if we focused on interventions at the prevent level, that has the greatest benefits. We are seeing more sustainable, basically a more sustainable future, if we just put the extra effort in creating those interventions. And I talk about a multi-level intervention approach, and this kind of goes back to, the igloo model, where we are not just talking about individual level interventions, we are talking about the holistic approach. A really important paper came out by Fleming last year. It's a massive study that he did, was to basically review all the individual level interventions that have been done, not just in law, again, much broader. So like mindfulness, resilience training, well-being apps. And what he found, based on data and evidence, is that those interventions alone are largely ineffective. They do have some effect, but actually it's not enough to sustain better well-being. And the reason for that is because they do not engage the root causes. So going back to job demands, job resources, the actual things in the work environment, the way people work, they are not looking at changing that. What we need to do is look at the group, leader, organizational level interventions combined with the individual level interventions, and that will give us where we want to be. The upward cycles, it will give us those protective paths, it will put us on that protective pathway. When I talk about organizational level interventions, what I'm talking about is actually work design. So it's those big questions which we need to think about, how can we change the way work is organized? Talk about flexible working. We're talking about achievable deadlines and targets. Leader level interventions, they look at the leader-lawyer interactions. Here we're talking about manager training, line manager support. What I haven't put in here is a really interesting study has come out in the UK about looking at manager training and mental health. And this was an interesting study because, you know, lots of studies have looked at the benefits for well-being outcomes. But the one I read, which was published, I think it was this year actually, talked about looking at the outcomes for businesses of manager training. And actually, we're talking about, you know, if we talk about profitability, productivity, that was the case. If you give your managers training, you will see better business outcomes. Obviously, you will see better well-being outcomes for your people, but you will also see better business outcomes coming from that. And then the group level interventions, they target group dynamics. We're talking about psychological safety, where people, it's not enough to, I mean, of course it will help, but to tell people that, you know, please raise any issues that you might have. But if you're not creating that culture where actually implicitly people feel safe to raise those things, that's going to be a problem. And that's where, you know, we are seeing a lot of regulatory interests coming at this. And what that is coming from is where mistakes are made and people don't feel safe to raise those mistakes. They keep it hidden. And obviously then regulators will be interested because it's affecting client outcomes and the public interest. So what I'm hoping, if there was one message that I could leave everyone with today, would be, let's look broader. Let's look at the holistic picture and let's look at making those changes at all of those different levels. So change is possible if we treat well-being as a systems issue where we don't just individualize problems and we work together as an organization with clients as well to think about systemic change. Interventions should be tailored to context. And what I mean by that is understand the context of your organization, the culture within your organization. That will vary like massively from organization to organization. And the only way to understand what your culture is to speak to and listen to your people and to get the data. I mean, the work that I do with organizations is very much around data and evidence, data-driven. When we live in a data world, firms gather so much data, but can we understand that better to drive better outcomes for our people and for the business? So it's kind of almost taking a research approach to your business, applying research within your organization. Involve staff in the process. Again, it's, you know, that really needs to happen. And it's such a basic thing in terms of giving people the autonomy, making them feel involved in the decisions that the firm is making, buy-in from leaders. Interventions are iterative. I think if you start off thinking you're going to have to implement massive changes, unfortunately, you're probably going to fail. If you start small and implement small changes like reducing team meetings or internal meetings, increasing ways of communication, these are small things that can have make a huge difference. So, you know, what I'm not suggesting is you go back to your firms and say, right, from tomorrow, we're going to not have billable hours, because that's a massive change. We've had the billable hour system for like 100 years. That, you know, those things will come. Those things will take some time. But in the meantime, you know, everyone likes quick wins. You get buy-in from your leaders, you get buy-in from your people. Focus on those quick wins and plan for the long haul. And change will be possible. You know, something which came to my mind when I was sitting down earlier is we sometimes think that, well, that's impossible to think about a completely different way of how lawyers work. That's impossible. But 100 years ago, for me as a woman, to be standing here in the New York City bar, addressing you today, that would be impossible. I would be laughed at if I had that vision. And yet here I am. You know, women are in senior positions. We have come so far. Change is possible. This is just another thing which we may think is impossible now. And hopefully in 100 years' time, it will be like, oh, that just made so much sense. It was, you know, why are they taking 100 years to get us to where we are? But, you know, these things will take time, but these things will happen. And really, then it's over to you, questions. And I love this quote, so I just put it in, because I think as a researcher, as someone who is, for all of us, as we embark on this change, the most important thing is to never stop questioning and to just try and ask as many questions, try and learn as much, and try and change as much as possible.
Do we have questions for Lucinda? Yeah, if you just wait and I'll bring the mic over to you. I'm going to limit them to a couple just because we've got time to catch up, but Lucinda's going to be around at lunchtime as well as Linda. So you can ask her that.
Hi, Lucinda. My name's Gwen Romans, and I'm an executive coach and a former partner at an AmLaw 5 firm. I do want to start out with a compliment. You may not have seen the TV series Succession. Towards the end of the series, the father says to his children, "You are not serious people." I want to say that you are a serious person, and I really value everything that you are doing, studying, and communicating. I do have one question. I appreciated that you touched on psychological safety. The lifeblood of law firms is obviously clients. And so I appreciate the client, we heard earlier from a client, a large client, corporate client. But one of the rubs is given that we're in the client service field, and my coaching clients certainly feel, how can I cement my relationships with my clients? How can I feel psychologically safe that they value my contributions, that they're not going to terminate our relationship? I think that is a really critical component of feeling psychologically safe in a firm. And a corollary question to that, or I guess that was more of a point than a question, is how do we square the focus today on flexible work arrangements with supportive supervision? I really think that firms are struggling on this point, and I'd love to hear any thoughts that you have on obviously calling people back into the office, because I do think that supportive supervision is really critical.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Completely agree with your first point. Absolutely. I think with the flexible, with remote working, the legal profession was kind of catapulted into a space with COVID-19, into a space where previously flexible working, well, I suppose remote working was never heard of, but suddenly we had to do it. And from an evidence perspective, there are benefits in terms of well-being, in terms of productivity, when people have that kind of hybrid situation where they are working remotely, and that comes from an increase in autonomy. That someone else talked about before. We are people, we have lives, and it's kind of fitting that all in. So there are benefits there. But I do hear what you're saying about how does that square with supportive supervision. And perhaps it takes, I'm just going to throw this out there, but perhaps it takes a way of us changing how we perceive what supervision should be. Because when we talk about supportive supervision, we think about how we have always done it, supervision in person. But, we can do it differently, and it can be possible for you to support your people remotely. And so, for example, it may take a different way of an approach. It may take you contacting them, or, and actually instigating more from a manager's perspective. Are you okay? Whereas previously in an office, you could take cues from someone if they weren't okay, if they looked a bit like they were not understanding something as well. I think it's possible to have supportive supervision in a remote world, but I think it would just take a few tweaks in the behaviors of how people interact with that. Does that I'd love to see your question.
Can I just add to that? Because I think one of the biggest barriers to the lack of effective supportive supervision at the moment is because it's not prioritized.
Mm.
I mean, how many of your firms have an incentive for their partners or other senior leaders to spend time supervising the juniors? I mean, there we go. And if this is fundamental to the lifeblood of a law firm, as well as to the well-being of the people, why aren't we doing that? And I started out in the profession back in 1820, and this stuff was, we did it. It was just a matter of course. It wasn't necessarily incentivized because you didn't need to. But now that we've incentivized people to do 2,400 billable hours, well, where's the space for this stuff? So we need to be incentivizing, and then it'll happen.
And just to add to that, I think, what I'm taking forward into supportive supervision space is, I think we need to define a bit better about when we talk about effective supervision as lawyers, I'm going to get this wrong, and I'm sure Tracy will remind me if I do. Model Rule 5.1 talks about supervision, but when we talk about supervision in a legal context, we talk about supervising them from a technical perspective, right? We talk about making sure that they're not going to do, that they're competent, that they're not going, your supervisees are not going to make mistakes from a technical perspective. Whereas if we look to other professions, they look at it from a well-being perspective as well. So supervision's not just looking at the technical competence. We're touching base with people to find out, are you coping? How are you doing? So I think, I like to think big, but I think we need a wholesale change in terms of how we define effective supervision in the legal profession, and to incorporate those well-being aspects.
I'm going to call it there because I suspect that we could be talking to Lucinda for the rest of our lives if we had the opportunity. I intend to, but anyway, thank you.